and welcome back to the channel. You join me today for something, well, a little different, but I hope just as enjoyable. It surrounds not the journeys that I'm making, but the waterways that I'm travelling on, or at least some of them. I ought to make a disclaimer at this point that my information for this has come from a number of sources, so I can't verify a lot of it, but a lot of it does sort of ring true with each other. They ring true with each other. So I'm going to say that they're mostly accurate, but if they're not, sorry. It all started when I was a week or so ago, when I was cruising along the Old West River. Now, as some of you will know, I lived in Cambridgeshire and worked in Cambridgeshire for sort of 27, 28 years. And most of the locals referred to that stretch of water as the Old West. Now, for me, it started at the Great Ouse and it ended at the Great Ouse, so I just automatically assumed it was part of the Great Ouse. Wrong. I did some research because I wanted to get my facts correct when I was doing the vlog for the Old West River cruise, to discover that it had never been part of the Great Ouse River. In fact, part of the Great Ouse River had never been part of the Great Ouse River, and what had been part of the Great Ouse River wasn't there anymore. And the more I delved into it all, the more I became intrigued with rivers that have been shortened, rivers that have been lengthened, rivers that have been created, and rivers that have been lost. Now, it does get very complicated. So I shall use some maps to help interpret it. But because of the complexity of it, I'm only covering the sort of Nene Great Ouse Basin. I don't cover Lincolnshire, or much of Lincolnshire. I don't cover Norfolk in terms of waterways within the Fen Basin. So this is something a little bit different. It's not, well, it is sort of partly history. It does go back to the sort of 17th century and beyond, but it also covers the modern waterways. So enjoy. I was travelling along a river that I thought, my logic told me, rightly or wrongly, my logic told me that it had the River Great Ouse. I knew that locally everybody knew it as the Old West, but I thought, well, it goes from the River Great Ouse to the River Great Ouse, ergo it must be the River Great Ouse. Turns out I was wrong. It, or is, the Old West, and was once known as Westwater. And when I looked into that, I also discovered that whilst today it travels from west to east, 400 or so years ago, it used to travel from east to west. Intriguing. And as I sort of delved into this, I discovered quite a lot had changed in the Fens. Now, we all know that the Fens have been drained and that Cornelius Vermuyden and the 4th Duke of Bedford, Francis Russell, played a big part in turning the Fens into an industrial landscape, which is what it is today. But before we get all the way to there, we perhaps need to put it into some sort of context. At the end of the last ice age, around about 10,000 years ago, as the ice cap melted, sea levels rose, and our land bridge with Europe, Doggerland, disappeared under the rising sea. And as sea levels continued to rise, the coastline that we're now all familiar with, the East Anglian coastline, came into being. But also, around about that time, as sea levels rose, the rivers that flowed through what was a relatively flat landscape, those rivers couldn't issue their water out to continue to drain the land, which at this point was mostly forest. And so that fresh water, because it couldn't escape, started to accumulate and flood the flat areas that we now know as the Fens, and in the Washes case, it disappeared under the sea. Now there's a whole different story about the trees that grew there falling over and accumulating in the accumulating peat, which are now referred to as bog oaks. And these are sort of 5,000–6,000 year old trees that once fell over, and because the ground was waterlogged, they didn't rot away basically, they didn't decompose. And you'll often see bog oaks where they've been excavated, sort of lying around on the ground. Unfortunately, once they are excavated, they don't survive. Now, around about 6,000–7,000 years ago, the fens were largely inundated, albeit quite shallow water in lots of cases, but there were islands such as Crowland and Ely where habitation was possible, and a lot of these became religious centres. But around the margins, the sort of Bronze Age communities had started to develop around there, and they were discovering that with a little bit of ditching here and there, certain times of the year, they could actually effectively farm the land. And that's how it continued for quite a few thousand years, until, I suppose, until the start of the new millennium, around about 2,000 years ago. And that's when the Romans came to town, or around about that time anyway. The Romans came to town, and they started to increase the amount of ditching that was carried out, and also embankments to keep water off of land or keep the sea out, or whatever it might have been. So often you'll see around some of the older habitations places with the names Roman Bank, because the original banks were erected by Romans. And then when the Roman era came to an end, when the Roman Empire started to collapse, the Anglo-Saxons didn't really have much of a stomach for ditching and embankments. So the whole thing deteriorated basically, and we went back to where, rather like a lot of the Roman infrastructure, it all started to crumble and disappear and was used for other things. In the meantime, the fens continued to remain wet, continued to be a massive ecological area, and with the start of the sort of Iron Age and smelting and the loss of forest, it was quite an important carbon sink. Now, all this time, over the thousands of years, peat had accumulated. I mentioned the bog oaks. Peat had also accumulated, and peat is basically, in a nutshell, is the aquatic vegetation that grows in this shallow water, and it was quite prolific because it was warm, there was plenty of sunshine to quite good depths, and the vegetation was prolific. And each year that vegetation grew, and it died back and sank to the bottom of this shallow water. And because of the reduced oxygen in the water, it didn't decompose. In fact, it would accumulate quicker than it can decompose. And it started to form peat over several thousand years. I mean, they do say that peat, it takes 1,000 years to accumulate a metre of peat. I'll come on to the loss of peat. Well, actually, I could do that now. So in an aquatic situation, peat will accumulate quicker than it can decompose. Once you drain peat, the opposite is the case, and in effect it becomes a big compost heap, and it will disappear with it. The increased oxygen will disappear at a phenomenal rate. So whereas it takes 1,000 years to accumulate a metre of peat, it might only take a few decades for that metre of peat to disappear through a process called oxidation. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit to the sort of 15th, 16th century, and those religious centres that I mentioned, the monasteries that were there, were quite keen on making sure that they could feed themselves, that they could feed their community. And so they were quite keen on keeping the ditches clear and the banks maintained to some degree. But quickly they were realising that because the land was drying out, and that process of oxidation that I mentioned meant that the land was sinking, and it became sort of an upside down world where the rivers and the ditches were higher than the land they were trying to drain, trying to keep dry. Then when, with the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in the sort of middle 16th century, those practices almost disappeared, well, did disappear. There was nobody there to sort of crack the whip, as it were, and the ditches fell into disrepair. The banks started to collapse or erode, and drainage of the fens was almost non-existent. Now, the Fen Basin is 3,800 square kilometres in extent. So, in the middle of the 17th century, a group of investors led by Lord Russell, the 4th Earl of Bedford, formed as gentlemen adventurers, they were referred to. And they looked to Holland for expertise on drainage and employed a Dutchman by the name of Cornelius Vermuyden to help them come and drain the fens. Vermuyden embarked on a course of straightening rivers to increase the flow, and also had new rivers dug. Vermuyden's drain, now more commonly known as the 40-foot drain, and the Bedford River, named after the 4th Earl of Bedford, they were designed to move water more quickly towards the sea, which was now a lot closer than it used to be. Now, sometime through these early decades of the drainage, Vermuyden's efforts to drain the fens, that oxidation process that I mentioned before was obviously still continuing, and the fens were continuing to sink, or as it was perceived then, the rivers were continuing to get higher and higher. But in time, it was realised that the rivers weren't getting higher and higher, it was the land that was getting lower and lower. In fact, at this point, it's generally recognised that on average, the fen soils, the fen levels, the peat, has dropped some 7 metres in the 400 years or so since Vermuyden started his drainage work. Now, with this dilemma of land levels sinking and water levels now sitting high and dry, as it were, above the land they were supposed to be draining, the old method of digging ditches and allowing the water to gravity feed out to sea simply wouldn't work, and it wasn't working. So some sorts of pumping mechanisms were employed. Now, these pumps took various forms, and in the early years they were wind-driven and very successful. They were all fairly ad hoc. You didn't go to a pump shop and buy a wind pump. You built one with the materials that were to hand, which was mostly timber. And these were driven, as I say, by wind, and men with a donkey would have had several pumps and were paid on piecemeal basis. So they would have several pumps to maintain. And if the wind changed direction, they'd be on the donkey, riding around to the wind pumps, turning the cap into the wind to keep the pumps turning. Later, again, the land is still sinking, don't forget. So wind pumps, often in the latter years of wind power, had to be built in series so that they would lift the water maybe 2 or 3 feet to another pump, which would then lift it another 2 or 3 feet, and so on. That wasn't sustainable. And so steam power was employed. You can see a wind pump, a very good example of a wind pump, at Wicken Fen in Cambridgeshire. Periodically, the wind pump, the sails are put up and opened up, and the wind pump is set to pump water. Nowadays, it pumps water onto the fen rather than off of the fen. With steam, there is a very nice old steam pump in Streatham, not far from Wicken, in fact, a place called Streatham Old Engine. It doesn't produce steam anymore, but all the mechanisms are there. And on high days and holidays, the place is opened up by volunteers, and you can go and have a look, and it's quite an impressive structure. Post that, diesel power was employed, and diesel power is still used as a backup to the modern electrical pumps, which now drain the bulk of the fens. The old diesel engines, again, near Ely, is the Prickwillow Drainage Museum. And if you're ever in the area, check out the opening times, because periodically they do fire up the old diesel pumps, and it's glorious. They're just wonderful things to listen to. Understanding where the rivers flowed in Roman times is quite fascinating. The Ouse, for instance, had a very different course. It turned north at Erith, ran past Chatteris and March to Upwell, Wisbech and then into the sea. The winding Chatteris and Somersham Road, for instance, follows the course of this old river and is reflected in the name Ferry Hill. The Cam flowed from Cambridge, past Ely and through what is now Littleport, before diverting from its present course and heading off through Welney and Upwell to join the Ouse and then on to Wisbech and the sea. During this period, the River Cam and the Great Ouse were completely different rivers and didn't come together until they got to Upwell. So prior to the drainage of the fens, upland water from Bedford and Huntingdon flowed through the lower lying areas of the fen via Wisbech to the sea. But then with the creation of the Bedford River and later the new Bedford River, the water flowed directly to Denver, Kings Lynn and the sea. Similarly, water from Cambridgeshire and the upland parts of Suffolk, which had also flowed through the lower lying areas of the fens, now flowed through a newly expanded or created and expanded channel to Denver, which then issued out into the sea. Now, as yet, we haven't really touched on the River Nene. Whilst the course of the Nene is pretty much as it's always been until it gets to Peterborough, like the other Fenland rivers, drainage work was carried out to straighten the course away from the lower lying Fenland areas. This allowed water to take a shorter and quicker route past Wisbech to the sea. Unlike the redundant sections of the River Cam and the River Ouse, which have largely disappeared, there are still sizable sections of the River Nene's old course, particularly through the town of March. So then, that's the Fenland waterways as we know them today. There's a river, the Old West, that flows in a different direction to its original course and doesn't get its water from upstream. There's another river, the Great Ouse, that's in two separate parts that are largely unconnected. There's also a river, the River Cam, that has been shortened by at least half of its length. And there's a river, the River Nene, whilst it's retained a lot of its former course, has lost a lot of its original character. Well then, that's the end of this potted history of Fenland waterways and the drainage thereof. I hope it's been interesting. I found it intriguing. There's stuff that I thought I knew, stuff that I didn't realise I knew, and other stuff that I learned. So it was very interesting to look into it. So I hope you enjoyed at least some of it and found some of it informative. So that's the end of this one. If you aren't already, please subscribe to the channel. It does help. If you want to know what happens when I resume my cruising, which I am already on, and whereabouts it is, then please click on the notification bell. And if you've found it marginally interesting, then give us a thumbs up. Okay, see ya.